Hello everybody, it is time to finish the Zombie Zone, to finish the very last A to Z mystery book. So where we left off, they're in New Orleans, and they're camping with this man named Jack, and while they were camping, they heard some strange noises, and they followed this guy to the graves, and he was hopping out of a grave, and we know that there's been grave robbing going on, and some people think it might be a zombie. Now, we're on to chapter 6. Dink woke up when he heard someone singing outside the tent. He peeked out and saw Jack opening the coolers. Sunlight slanted across the water, turning the Gulf to gold. A sweet-smelling breeze came with the sun. It was a perfect morning, and Dink was hungry. As Dink pulled on his sneakers, he thought of last night. He laughed. No way it could have been Jack in the grave. No way. Dink nudged Josh and Ruth Rose awake, then unzipped the flap and left the tent. Jack was wearing shorts and a t-shirt again. Hey, he said, smiling at Dink. I brought fruit and bagels and juice. You hungry? Yeah, my stomach is rumbling, Dink said. Mine is too, Josh said, joining them. Ruth Rose came next, fixing her headband. Jack carried the food down to one of the flat-bottomed boats to use as a tabletop. They looked out over the water as they ate. Look, Jack said, pointing along the shore. A mother squirrel and 2 young ones were sitting at the water's edge. They washed their hands and faces, then waddled back into the trees. When are we going to see the alligator nest? Josh asked. Jack checked his watch. Pretty soon, but I want to check on Myrna first. Do you mind? He asked. She seemed worried yesterday. Sure, Dink said. But what will we do with the tent and stuff? I'll get it later, Jack said. Are you going to tell Myrna what we saw last night? Asked Ruth Rose. Jack chewed his lower lip for a few seconds. If I'm right and it was one of the village men, she'd already know about it, he said, but I'll definitely mention it to her. The kids helped Jack tidy up. Then they hiked toward the small village. Myrna was there, weeding her garden. Myrna looked up at Jack. Everyone's at the graveyard, she said. I came to see how you're doing, Jack told her. Myrna sat on the edge of her porch. She stretched her back and wiped dirt from her hands. My friend Bo wants to leave here. One of the robbed graves is his father's. She glanced up at Jack. I'm worried, too. I'd be worried, too, if this weird stuff was going around. Just then, Jack's cell phone rang. He answered, listened, then said, Okay, hun, see you in a few minutes. Is the baby coming? Asked Dink. I don't know, but my wife said she feels funny, Jack said. She wants to go see her doctor. Do you mind if I take you back to the hotel for a while? I'll pick you up later and we can check out that alligator nest. They can stay with me, Myrna offered. Go, see your wife. The kids will be fine here until you get back. Is that okay with your guys? Jack asked. Sure, Ruth Rose said. But will you let my grandmother know? She keeps her cell phone with her while she's painting. Jack nodded. I'll call her from the van, he said. He took off jogging back toward the trail. See you in an hour, he called over his shoulder. I'd better finish this weeding, Myrna said. She hiked her dress up and got down on her knees in the garden. The bottoms of her feet were black from the rich soil. Myrna, did one of the men go out to guard the cemetery last night? Dink asked. The woman sat back up. Why are you asking? Jack was going to ask you, but he forgot, Dink said. Myrna shook her head. I don't know. Listen, while I work on the garden, why don't you kids go out and explore, she said. What if we get lost? Josh asked. Then I'll come get you, Myrna said, reaching into a deep pocket and pulling out a whistle on a lanyard. My grandkids use this when they come visit me, she said, dropping the lanyard around Josh's neck. Don't your grandchildren live here? Dink asked. Myrna shook her head. My son took his family and moved away, she said, gazing at her simple hut. Myrna yanked a weed from between some clumps of lettuce. Go, play for a while, she said. The kids left Myrna and walked to the edge of the clearing. I want to go back to the cemetery, Ruth Rose said. Yuck, why? Josh asked. Aren't you curious? Ruth Rose asked. Or do you believe we saw a zombie last night? I don't know, and I don't care, Josh said. That totally creeped me out. Oh, come on, Josh, Dink said. Now that it's daylight, we might find a clue as to who was down in that grave. Okay, I'll go, but don't try to get me to climb down in it, Josh said. The kids found the path to the graveyard. When they got there, they saw dozens of village people on their knees near 2 empty graves. Their heads were bowed and no one was saying a word. I think they're praying, Dink whispered. Let's keep going. They moved quietly away, following the iron fence. They came to the beginning of another narrow path, opposite the one that led to Myrna's hut. Josh peered down into the path. He was holding onto Myrna's whistle with one hand. What's down there? He asked nervously. That's what we're going to find out, Ruth Rose said. They walked single file. Ruth Rose led, and Josh hiked right behind her, which is why he nearly walked up her heels when she suddenly stopped. What? Dink asked when he was standing next to Ruth Rose. Ruth Rose didn't say anything. She was pointing to the ground. Then Dink and Josh saw it too. Ruth Rose had spotted large footprints in the moist red clay. Oh my gosh, Josh moaned. Zombie feet. So there the kids are. And there are big footprints leading away in the dirt. Chapter 7. Look, there's another one, Dink said, pointing ahead on the path. And another. I wonder who made them, Ruth Rose said. She knelt down and put her finger in one of the prints. These are toe marks. Did you guys notice if that guy in the grave was barefooted? Dink shrugged. He put his own foot next to the print. It's nearly twice as long as mine. Let's follow them, Ruth Rose said. Josh nearly choked. Are you crazy? Josh, don't you want to know whose feet these are? Dink asked. It could be the grave robber. Come on, Ruth Rose said, taking the lead again. As they walked the trail, the soil changed from dark red to brown to almost black. They had no trouble finding more footprints in the soft earth. Suddenly, Josh stopped. He stuck his nose in the air like a wolf. I smell food, he said. What? Dink asked. Hot dogs? Josh shook his head. Something sort of spicy, he said, like chili. Chili in the woods? Dink asked. Gee, maybe there's a restaurant out here in the middle of nowhere. The next one to stop suddenly was Ruth Rose. She put her finger to her lips. Shh, listen, she hissed. A few seconds later, they all heard a thunk. Then there were more thunks. The kids stared at each other with raised eyebrows. Ruth Rose kept walking and the others followed. The trail ended in a sunny clearing. Dink, Josh, and Ruth Rose stood and gaped. Straight ahead was a small cabin built from stuff you'd find in a junkyard. Old hunks of tin, mismatched boards, sheets of plastic, even the rusted hood of a car. The cabin was raised off the ground on thick tree stumps. A gigantic tree shaded the house. Dink noticed a tire swing hanging from one of the branches. He wondered if kids lived here. Standing with his back to them was a tall man holding an axe. His hair was so light it looked white. He wore long pants and a long-sleeved shirt. Below the pant bottoms, Dink could make out large, bare feet. The man raised the axe over his head and brought it down on a log. When he went to grab the two split pieces, he noticed the kids watching him. Great, so now they're in the middle of the woods, and they find a man with an axe. These kids get in so much danger. Dink was surprised. He had expected an older man, but the face staring at them was smooth. The man had warm brown eyes. He looked no older than Jack. Hello, the man said. His voice was deep but gentle. Are you lost? Dink spoke up. No, we're exploring, he said. Are you hungry? The tall man asked. No, do not eat this strange man's food. Behind the stack of firewood, a fire was burning in a pit. A black iron pot was suspended over the flames, and the smell of something spicy filled the air. We just had breakfast, Ruth Rose said, but thank you anyway. Good work, Ruth Rose. My name is Byron, said the man. I'm Ruth Rose, and these are my friends, Dink and Josh, Ruth Rose said. Dink saw an easel set up under a tree. Can we look at your painting? He asked. Okay, Byron said, blushing. The three kids walked over to the easel. Byron had painted an old iron fence. Hanging over the fence was a tree branch dripping with Spanish moss. The moon shone down, bathing the scene with a soft glow. The space behind the fence was blank. It's not finished yet, Byron said, from behind Dink, startling him. How could such a big guy walk so silently, Dink wondered. So the painting they describe seeing is the one in the chapter picture. There's an iron fence and a tree with moss hanging down over it, which also looks familiar. Chapter 8. Your picture is excellent, Ruth Rose said. My grandmother likes to paint too. Byron smiled and blushed. He walked toward this little garden. Do you like strawberries? Sure, Josh said, and the kids followed Byron. The garden was neatly laid out in rows. A shovel and hoe stood leaning against a small tree. There were tomatoes, lettuce, cucumbers, and some things Dink didn't recognize. One corner of the garden was filled with strawberry plants. Byron told Dink, Josh, and Ruth Rose to help themselves. The kids waded into the patch carefully as they picked up bright red berries. Suddenly they heard a whoosh, and a large owl flew out of the trees. The bird landed on Byron's wrist and plucked a strawberry from his hand. This is Bill, the man said. He's awesome, Josh said. Byron stretched his arm toward Josh. You can pet him, he said proudly. This guy is a pet owl. It's very interesting. While Josh was petting Bill, Ruth Rose poked Dink on the arm. When he looked at her, she noticed... Wait. A very loud motorcycle. Okay. When he looked at her, she nodded toward the shovel a few feet away. The edge of the shovel blades were caked with red clay. Byron carried Bill over to the soup pot. The kids watched him scoop out something and feed it to the owl. That red dirt looks the same as the dirt in the graveyard, Ruth Rose whispered. So what? Josh said, plucking another berry from the patch. Josh, that could mean Byron was digging in the cemetery, she said, keeping her voice low. The soil here in his garden is black, not red. Josh's hand stopped halfway to his mouth. His eyes shut, then flew open again. You mean that could have been him in the cemetery last night? Not so loud, Dink whispered. Guys, I'm sure there's red clay in other places around here, not just at the cemetery. I saw the same color on the floor of Jack's van yesterday. Josh stole a look at Byron, who was still feeding Bill. That guy we saw last night had light hair like Byron's, he whispered. And look at his big feet. He could have made those footprints we saw near the cemetery. None of that proves anything, Dink said. He remembered Jack in the moonlight last night. Jack's blonde hair had looked silvery, the same as the hair of the mystery man in the cemetery. I have some other ideas, Dink added quietly. Just then Byron looked up and smiled at the kids. Do you want to swing on my tire? He asked. No, thank you, Ruth Rose said. We have to be getting back. Byron tossed Bill into the air and the bird disappeared into the trees. Then Byron walked toward the kids and stretched out a huge hand. It was very nice to meet you, he said. Dink shook Byron's hand. Beneath the skin, Dink felt the man's strength. It was nice meeting you too, Dink said. The kids walked toward the trail. When Byron and the cabin were out of sight, they began running. 5 minutes later, they stopped, panting in front of Myrna's little hut. Myrna was sitting on her porch talking with a woman dressed in shorts and a t-shirt. "Did you kids have fun?" Myrna asked. "Yes," Josh said. "We met a big guy named Byron and pet his owl. He showed us his painting," Ruth Rose said. "He sure is a good artist." Myrna nodded. "Byron makes his own paints from nature," she said. "He gathers berries and digs up roots, anything he can find. He grinds the stuff up to create his different colors." Myrna introduced the woman to the kids. "Lucy is a friend of Jack," she said. "She'll drive you back to the hotel." Lucy smiled at the kids. "Jack's at the hospital with his wife," she said. "Looks like today's the day for the baby to be born." They said goodbye to Myrna and followed Lucy to the trail. They had only gone a short distance when they saw a man approaching them. He was hurrying toward the village. When the man noticed Lucy and the kids, he stopped. His face was red and sweaty. "Am I on the right trail for the village?" he asked. The man was wearing a straw hat, dressy pants, and a striped shirt. His briefcase and shiny black shoes looked out of place in the forest. Even with the hat, Dink recognized the man. He had been sitting near them at the hotel restaurant yesterday. What was he doing in the woods? "Yes, about another 5 minutes straight ahead," Lucy said. Then she added, "Is anyone expecting you?" "Yes," the man said, then hurried on his way. "That's odd," Lucy said after the man left. She chuckled. "If he's a salesman, he'll have a hard time selling anything." They kept walking. When they passed the zombie sign, Dink asked Lucy about it. "I have no idea what that means or who put it there," Lucy said. "Jack thought it might be a joke," Ruth Rose said. "Not very funny," Lucy said. "A lot of people who live near these parts believe in zombies." Chapter 9. Lucy dropped the kids off and they traipsed into the hotel. "What are we going to do about Byron?" Josh asked. "I think he dug up those graves and I think he was the guy we saw in the cemetery last night." "Let's talk upstairs," Dink said quietly. They took the elevator. On their floor, Ruth Rose unlocked the room she shared with her grandmother. "Here's what I think," Dink said, sitting on the carpet. "The man we saw in the cemetery last night might have dug up those 2 graves, but we don't know that for sure." Josh and Ruth Rose slopped down next to Dink. "And we don't know if the guy we saw was Byron either," Dink went on. "Well, I think it was Byron," Josh said. "Who else could it be?" "How about Jack?" Dink asked. "He's tall and he has light hair like the man we saw in the cemetery." "Jack?" Ruth Rose asked, "but he was sleeping in his hammock." "Did you actually see him in the hammock when we left?" Dink asked. "Jack could have gone to the cemetery after we were asleep and made it back to the campsite before we did." Josh shook his head. "Why would Jack be down inside that grave?" he asked. "I don't know," Dink said, "but I don't know why Byron would either." "I just thought of someone else with light hair," Ruth Rose said. Dink and Josh looked at her. "That man we passed on the trail with Lucy," she said. "He was wearing a funny hat, but underneath it his hair was kind of grayish-white." "And you know what else?" Dink said. "He and another guy were sitting in the restaurant when we had lunch with your grandmother yesterday." "So?" said Josh. "Well, they seemed pretty interested when we were talking about zombies and stuff," Dink said. Josh laughed. "Who wouldn't be?" he said. Just then the kids heard a light thump coming from the hallway. They froze, all staring at the doorknob as it slowly turned. So it sounds like we have 3 suspects so far. We have Jack, we have Byron, and we have the guys from the restaurant. Wonder what you guys are thinking. Suddenly the door swung open and Ruth Rose's grandmother walked in. "What's the matter with you 3? She asked, setting down her paint box. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Gram, you've scared us," Ruth Rose cried. "Me? I'm just a harmless old lady." "So, how was the sleep out with Jack?" she said. "We had a nice time, Gram," Ruth Rose said. "We've just been trying to figure out who robbed those graves." Ruth Rose's grandmother sat on her bed and kicked off her sandals. "Can I help?" she asked. Ruth Rose told her grandmother all about the cemetery last night and about the man they saw crawling out of the grave. "My word," her grandmother said. "Did you tell Jack what you saw?" "Yes," Dink said. "He said it was probably one of the men from the village guarding the cemetery." "Dink thinks the guy we saw was Jack," Josh said. "I didn't say it was Jack," Dink responded. "I said it could be. The person in the grave was tall and he had light hair and dark clothes just like Jack. And just like Byron," Josh said. Ruth Rose's grandmother looked at Josh. "Now, who's Byron?" she asked. "He's this man we met after Jack took his wife to the hospital this morning," Ruth Rose said. "Yes, Jack kindly called me and let me know you'd be staying in the village with someone named Myrna," her grandmother said. "But you decided to go back to the cemetery, right?" "We wanted to look for clues," Ruth Rose said. "But the villagers were all in the cemetery, so we followed some footprints. They led right to the cabin in the woods. That's where we met Byron and his owl Bill." "I think Byron's the guy we saw in the graveyard," Josh interrupted. "I think he stole those coffins, too, because there was red dirt on his shovel, just like the clay in the cemetery." Finally, Ruth Rose told her grandmother about the man they'd met on the path. "It could have been him, too," she said. "He had light hair, and he seemed pretty interested in the village. Dink mentioned the same man had been eating lunch near them yesterday. I think he was trying to hear what we were saying," he said. "Okay, you've mentioned 3 different men who are all tall with light hair," Ruth Rose's gram said. "One of them could be the man you saw last night. What I don't understand is why any of them would have any interest in that cemetery." "I just thought of something," Dink said. "When we walked down to the water with Jack, he told us he'd love to buy a piece of that land." Everyone was staring at Dink. What if Jack put up that sign and dug up the graves to scare the villagers? Dink continued. If they left, maybe he'd be able to buy their land. So now we have a motive. Chapter 10. Well, I still think Byron did it, Josh said. He stuck up 3 fingers. 1, there's red clay on his shovel. 2, he... 2, he could have left those huge footprints we saw. 3, he's a painter, so he could have painted that sign. Byron paints? Asked Ruth Rose's grandmother. We only saw 1 painting, Ruth Rose said, but it was real good. Ruth Rose's grandmother reached for her sandals. I have a hard time imagining that Jack is involved with grave robbing, she said. But I would very much like to meet Byron. They flagged down a taxi in front of the hotel. Dink told the driver they wanted to go the Old Forest Trail. Got it, the driver said as she moved slowly into the late afternoon traffic. 10 minutes later, Ruth Rose's grandmother paid the driver. Will you pick us up here in an hour? She asked. Sure thing, the driver said. She waved and drove away. Ruth Rose's grandmother looked at the dark and dense forest in front of them. Are you sure there's a trail in here? She asked. Josh showed her the plaque. Don't worry about snakes, he said bravely. I wasn't even thinking about snakes until you mentioned them, Ruth Rose's grandmother said. This time Josh led the way as they hiked the trail. They stopped when they came to the zombie sign. That is strange, Ruth Rose's grandmother said. Somebody definitely wants people to think there are zombies around here. We think it's the same guy who dug up the graves, Ruth Rose said. Her grandmother nodded. What a busy little zombie. They hiked on and soon came to Myrna's village. No one was around. Look, they're all in that big hut, Dink said, pointing to the largest of the buildings. The door was open and the kids could see people sitting on benches. Dink heard a voice speaking firmly. They're having some kind of meeting, Ruth Rose said. Maybe it has something to do with the dug-up graves. Is it very far to Byron's cabin from here? Her grandmother asked. No, Dink said, pointing. That trail goes to the cemetery, and then you take a little path to where Byron lives. The 3 kids led Ruth Rose's grandmother down a trail. They stopped at the little cemetery. Someone worked hard to dig those graves up, Ruth Rose's grandmother commented, pointing to the mounds of red dirt near the 2 empty holes. See, Graham, that's the same clay we saw in Byron's shovel, Ruth Rose said. Yes, but I would assume red clay could be found in other places, her grandmother said. They continued walking. A few minutes later, they stood in the trees behind Byron's cabin. I don't see him, Ruth Rose whispered, peering around a tree trunk. Why don't we just go knock on his door, her grandmother suggested. Josh giggled. I don't know if he even has a door, he said. Come on, Dink said. He stepped into the sunshine. The 4 sons walked around the cabin. Byron was standing in front of his easel with a brush in his hand. Small jars of paint were lined up on the easel's tray. Hi, Byron, Dink said. Byron turned around quickly. He had a blob of white paint on his chin. When he saw the kids, he broke into a wide smile. This is Mrs. Hathaway, my grandmother, Ruth Rose told Byron. Byron picked up a cloth to wipe his hands. Putting out one hand, he said, Hello, I'm very pleased to meet you. I've heard a lot about you, Ruth Rose's grandmother said with a warm smile. May I look at your painting? Byron blushed. I have better ones in my house, he said. They all studied Byron's painting. Since this morning, Byron had added something. He had painted tombstones inside the fence. Now Dink recognized the iron fence. It was the fence at the cemetery. I think you're a truly wonderful painter, Ruth Rose's grandmother told Byron. This is the cemetery, isn't it? Dink asked Byron. The tall man nodded. I like it there, he said. Do you go there a lot? Dink asked. Bill likes to hunt mice at night, Byron said. Sometimes I go with him. I sit by the cemetery. It's peaceful there. Did you see anyone digging in the cemetery? Dink asked. Suddenly Byron's face grew red. He put his brush down. I didn't mean to steal it, he said. What? Steal what? Asked Ruth Rose. Byron walked to his cabin and came back holding something in his hand. It was a man's leather wallet. It was sitting by the cemetery last week. It was dark and Bill was hunting, Byron said. 2 men came and dug up the graves. They carried the coffins away. When they were gone, I found this in the dirt. I saved it for them, but they didn't come back. That's what the guy was doing in the grave last night, Josh said, looking for his wallet. Ruth Rose's grandmother took the wallet and looked inside. How nice, she said. He even has a picture on his business card. The kids looked at the white card. The name was J. Frisk, painted in big black letters. Below the name, it said land developer, with a phone number and an email address. Next to the name was a small picture of the man they'd passed on the path. I get it, Dink said. This guy dug up those graves to scare the villagers into selling their land. Now everything makes sense, Josh said. This Frisk guy is the zombie. He probably put up that sign, too. What should we do? Dink asked. Ruth Rose's grandmother whipped out her cell phone. She dialed information, then said, New Orleans Police Department, please. So it sounds like it wasn't Jack and it wasn't Byron. It was these 2 guys that they'd been seeing, and they're land developers, so they wanted to buy the land. Chapter 11. The next morning, Jack picked up the kids after breakfast. Ruth Rose was wearing pink from her headband to sneakers. You look like a sunrise, Jack told her. Thanks, Jack, Ruth Rose said. Was your baby born yet? Yes, the proud father said. It's a beautiful little girl. Teresa and her mom are sleeping, so now's our chance to get a peek at the alligator nest. A half hour later, they were all hunkered down in some bushes near the water. Jack had brought binoculars, and they were taking turns peering at the mother alligator. She was lying half in the water with her long snout pointed toward her nest. The gator's scaly hide was blackish green, ridged and bumpy like a truck tire. I don't see any babies, whispered Josh. They haven't hatched yet, Jack said, pointing to a small hill of vegetation. That mound is her nest. The eggs are buried in that stuff. Why isn't she sitting on her nest? Ruth Rose asked. Won't the eggs get cold? The rotting vegetation keeps the eggs warm, Jack explained. Mama Gator is watching the water in case a meal swims by. The large mother alligator lay as still as a log. Her mouth was partly open, and every now and then her eyes would blink. You kids did a good job figuring out who robbed those graves, Jack said. The villagers reburied the coffins and had a nice ceremony. The cops took the two developers in for some serious questions. They won't be trying to scam any more people. Do you think the people in the village were really going to sell their land? Dink asked. They would have eventually, Jack said. My guess is that if the rob graves didn't convince them, the scammers would have tried something else next time. They were greedy guys who wanted to build high-rise apartments there. If Byron hadn't been out with his owl, he never would have seen those men, Josh said, or found that wallet. Jack smiled. Byron told Myrna that he'd been out on his own since his parents abandoned him when he was 8 years old. Never went to school, just lived in these woods. Myrna and the villagers are building him a new hut near hers. He's going to live with them now. And Byron gave my grandmother one of his paintings, Ruth Rose said. She showed it to a man who owns an art gallery. He said Byron's going to make a ton of money. Jack put his finger to his lips. Listen, he whispered. They all heard high, croaky noises coming from the nest. Now watch, Jack said. The mother alligator began moving toward the mound. When she got there, she scraped away the top layer of vegetation. 20 or 30 tiny green and yellow alligators were crawling out of their eggs. As they freed themselves, they wiggled toward their mother. Now check this out, Jack said quietly. The mother alligator flattened herself on the ground. With her jaw open, the baby scrambled over her bottom jaw right into her mouth. That is crazy. That's really what baby alligators do. They're kind of cute for alligators. Is she going to eat them? Josh asked. Jack laughed. No, that's how mama alligators and crocodiles protect their babies, he said. They're safe inside her mouth. Protect them from what? Josh asked. Ruth Rose taking her turn with the binoculars. There are a lot of critters who would love to snack on a baby alligator, Jack said. Raccoons, possums, herons, you name it. When Mama thinks it's safe, she'll open her mouth and her babies will crawl out. The four backed quietly away and headed for the trail. Speaking of lunch, Josh said as they hiked, I'm hungry. Josh, no one was talking about lunch, Dink said. Josh grinned. Now we are, he said. The end. There's the mama with her babies. And there are the kids leaving. And the book says, the end. None of the other ones end that way. We did it. We read the entire A to Z mystery series, even not being in school. That's so crazy. I would love to hear what your favorite A to Z mystery book of the whole series is. We know that mine is The Missing Mummy. I also really love The Runaway Racehorse and The X'd Out X-Ray and The Goose is Gold. I think those are probably like my top favorites. I wonder what your top favorites are. Please let me know. I can't wait to hear. Hope you enjoyed The Zombie Zone, and I hope you enjoyed the whole A to Z mystery series. See you later. Bye.